Greetings and salutations. Welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this video with a friend, and leave a comment down below. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is the Tony Award-winning author of the full-length plays Outrage, Bach at Leipzig, Celebrity Row, The Four of Us, Yellow Jackets, Back, Completeless, and The Whistleblower. And the musicals Nobody Loves You with Gabby Alter, Fortress of Solitude with Michael Friedman, and The Band's Visit with David Yazbek. His work has appeared on Broadway, off-Broadway, and elsewhere in New York at regional theaters across the country and in Canada, Hong Kong, Israel, Venezuela, Turkey, and Chile. And he is published by Faber and Faber and Samuel French. He's received new play commissions from the McCarter, Playwrights Horizons, Berkeley Rep, the Wilma Theater, South Coast Rep, Manhattan Theater Club, Lincoln Center, and the Goodman. He holds an MFA in dramatic writing from NYU and has taught playwriting at Yale and NYU. He's a member of the Dramatists Guild and is a New York Theater Workshop usual suspect. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Itamar Moses.
You read the whole thing.
I should have been off book.
No. It was very thorough. I appreciate especially the listing of all the titles, because some are not as well known as others, but they're all equally beloved to me. So I like the lesser known plays to be acknowledged.
Which we'll get to some of that at the end, definitely. Now, I've heard of Yellow Jackets from isn't there like a Netflix series or something like that?
No relationship to.
Just checking. Okay.
Showtime series about a girls' soccer team stranded in the woods. I went to Berkeley High School in Berkeley, California, and the mascot is the Yellow Jacket.
Got it.
In Berkeley, as it is of the high school in the TV show, actually. But Yellow Jackets is a play I wrote for Berkeley Rep about my high school.
Okay. All right. So now the one thing that we didn't list on this is your latest venture, which is, and let's break into that now.
Sure.
Is the adaptation of An American Tale.
That's right. Yes, I'm in the middle of rehearsals.
Okay, now.
Yeah, the premiere of a stage adaptation of An American Tale for Children's Theater Company in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. How does that work? Because one of the things that is happening with this, and I think maybe this is where I make an excuse or an exception, because usually in past episodes, I talk about the one thing that just drives me nuts, and that's personification of things, whether that's
anthropomorphizing,
like whether it's an animal or a sperm and an egg or a haunted house. But this is different because I guess this is where it's exceptional where it's exception because it's children's theater. So of course you're not going to. It's not animated, it's live action. So of course you're going to be having people play mice and other animals.
Yeah.
So how does the adaptation work? I mean, is it true to the original musical? Like there's nothing that's changed. You're just putting it on stage, or what's the creative license you took in order to get it on stage, and what did you change?
That's a really good question. My approach to adaptation is, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Like,
sure.
You don't need to make changes just for the sake of making changes, just to put your own stamp on something. If something works and will work just as well translated from whatever the original form is onto the stage, then do yourself the favor of keeping it that way. But stage is such a specific form, not so dissimilar from movies, but different enough. In a movie you have weird things happening in my computer. In a movie, you have visual storytelling tools. You have the camera. You can direct the audience's attention really specifically. You can do close-ups, let alone in animation, which is what the original American Tale is, where you can have anything happen just by drawing it. So one big piece of accomplishing the adaptation had to do with the limitations / possibilities of the stage, where things are much more about illusion and abstraction and suggestion, right? You mentioned people playing animals. So that's a task for the costume designer. How do we suggest that these are mice, these are cats, these are cockroaches? How do we suggest scale, which is a challenge for the set or prop designer? This is a giant thing that's like a tiny human object, and consistency of scale. The cats are so much larger than the mice, and so we've hired a puppetry designer to create, puppet cats that can be large and scary from the perspective of mice. On the script level, part of it was similar because you can't really do action sequences on stage.
Sure.
The same effectiveness you can do them definitely in a cartoon. So it was about, discrete scenes that hold a location as opposed to moving quite so quickly through everything the way the movie does. And then when you watch the movie now, there's a couple of things that sort of beg for expansion. First of all, the movie only has 3 or 4 songs in it, which is not enough for a full stage musical. So
Sure.
Even if we kept all of them, and we did keep, I think, 3 of the 4 songs from the movie, we still needed to write 8 or 9 more, right? Some of those are suggested by stuff that's already in the story, or we can drill down into this moment and make a song. But some of it is building out the story to earn those song moments. The other thing is that the middle of the movie moves very quickly through a bunch of really sort of important pillars of mouse society. They go to Tammany Hall, they have this big rally. And when you watch it now, and when you think about putting it on stage, it really feels like there's this opportunity in the situations and the characters that the movie already sets up for going a little deeper into the conflicts among the mice, like the different factions, and how they have to come together to stand against this common enemy that they have in the cats. And then the last thing was that the movie is very much about immigration and new arrivals to America trying to make their way. But the immigrant groups depicted in the movie are Fievel and his family, who are Russian Jewish mice. And then you have Irish immigrant mice and Italian immigrant mice. And that's kind of it. And in fact, there were like many, many other immigrant groups in New York at the time. There was a huge German immigrant population. There was an African-American community. Chinatown already existed. So along with building out the story a little bit, what went along with that was kind of broadening and like enriching the tapestry. Because who doesn't who doesn't want to see Mouse Chinatown? I mean, what a great opportunity
Sure.
for designers. So it was all of that, but every single thing that'll be on stage is at the very least something that grew out of a seed of what was in the movie. The setup is the same, and it's almost all the same characters and so on.
Do you think that going back to the personification aspect, but do you think that the children are a little bit more not susceptible to but suspending disbelief? They're more open to suspending disbelief to buy into that world.
I think so.
And they don't think about it really.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the stories to which kids are exposed, and I don't even mean like Disney and Pixar.
Sure.
I mean, going back much farther and to much more primal sources, Grimm fairy tales or Aesop's fables.
Sure.
There's a way that children, I think, feel and understand incredibly powerful and complex emotions and psychological states. If anything, we feel things more intensely when we're kids. Our feelings are out of control, but we don't have the language, we don't have the sophistication. And so that's why, crazy stories about 2 kids getting lost in the woods and then a witch tries to eat them, right? That's a horrifying story, but kids love it. And it's because it allows them to have a place to put the really terrifying feelings that you have as a kid, but that there isn't place for in the real world. Like you're mad at your mom because she won't let you go to the birthday party you want to go to, and you hate your mom, and you can't, but your mom is also your mom. You can't hate her. It's not safe to hate her because you're a 4-year-old kid. You read a story where there's an evil witch and you're like, oh, you put those feelings there. The evil witch is bad. My mom is good. So there's this way, there's a great book by the psychologist Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment that's all about this. So American Tail is just like an extension of that tradition. Like kids don't understand like the Cossacks having pogroms in Russia and driving out, Jewish villagers. They don't understand like a sweatshop where kids have to stitch clothes because of like the exploitation inherent in like unfettered capitalism, right? But they understand that mice are afraid of cats. And so you can use the cats as like a metaphor for all of these things, like all forms of oppression or exploitation. So I think that's why it's like a fable. It's like the right form to get this stuff across to kids.
Is this your first endeavor into children's theater? Or have you done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the way that you're speaking, this might come as a rhetorical question because my guess is you probably don't. You didn't take a dumbed down approach to this adaptation.
No, not dumbed down. Actually, I would say that first of all, when I began it, I almost to a fault was like, I'm not going to think about this being for kids at all. I'm just going to write a smart, funny show. I'm going to try to keep it moving. Like adult audiences don't like to be bored either, right? So just, keep it moving. And then I didn't, and also kids are smart. They understand more than we think. And you don't really need to write down to them. But the people at Children's Theater Company have been very helpful because they do this all the time, right? This is all they do is they stage shows where half or more of the audience is children. And they have a really good instinct for when those kids are going to start shifting in their seats and get bored. And, it goes along with my own instincts and the instincts of the rest of the creative team in terms of when things are starting to drag. But it's like a little bit more exacting, like the bar's a little bit higher. In a way, it's just like having not an unforgiving audience, but like an audience that's a little easier to lose than the average audience. So that's the only allowance I think that you made.
So on that note, then how do you, like when you're in the development process, how do you know when it's starting to drag?
Partly it's an instinct honed over doing this, not children's theater, but theater, but plays, musicals. You can start to develop, I think you have it right away. Like when I was starting, I guess I can only speak for myself, but like when I was starting out, you do like a reading around the table of a new play. And you can feel these moments. It's almost like a physiological feeling. It's not your brain. It's your body telling you like, I suddenly feel very hot and like full of dread. And it's because on like a visceral level, I feel like these 3 pages that we just read don't work. Like there's something wrong with them. I haven't nailed something. And there's no audience in the room. It's just you and, some actors or whatever and a couple other people maybe. But you feel that like, oh, if we did that part in front of an audience, it wouldn't work. And I think you have all kinds of reactions and instincts when you're listening to stuff, but I think what I've learned over time is which ones to listen to, and this feeling of like that goes on to, and it's funny because just hearing it read aloud by other people, because I guess they're the audience, the actors reading it themselves are the first audience. I could be staring at my laptop screen alone and being like, should it be this line or this line? Should the story turn this way or this way? And they seem equally good, and I can make arguments either way. And it's a cerebral process. I'm trying to decide. As soon as you're in that room hearing it aloud, it's so obvious. You're like, oh, that way's terrible. I was just holding on to it because I like that one joke, or I wanted to get back at that one person who will know it's about them. Like whatever wrong reason you were holding on to that. And you're like, no, it's got to go this way, or some third option you didn't see. So, but even then, you learn a whole nother level of that kind of information as soon as you're really seeing it in front of a paying audience, honestly, a full paying audience of people who have no agenda other than we would like to enjoy this show,
When you get that feeling, when that rush of,
the feeling I'm talking about.
Yeah. When that happens, do you know, is it that the scene that whole scene is it needs to go, or exactly where it needs to be, do you know what needs to be fixed, or is that the whole scene is just,
it needs to go? It depends. It depends, but the feeling I've really learned to trust, and sometimes it's almost an anticipatory feeling, where it's like, especially if it was like coming, you're like, oh, I can feel that I remember the decision I made while writing, and I can feel that this next part isn't going to work now that we're actually doing it. I don't always know what's wrong or what the solution is, but I've learned to listen to that feeling. And sometimes this isn't really what you asked, but a technique I've adopted is that when I get back to my computer and I'm alone again, working on it again, and let's say I I was coasting along and having the opposite of that feeling where you're sort of high on how well it's going. This all works. And then you get to page 17, and halfway down page 17, you start to be like, oh God, no. And then we sort of got him back on page 23, right? Let's say. And so what I sort of do is then I go back into the script, I go to page 17, and I just like copy everything that works like into a new document. And like, what if it were blank after this? Like, what if up until the very last moment it felt like it was working, I had written nothing else? And you've still got the thing you wrote in some other document, but then you're like, what if it was just blue sky after that? And then you start sort of like copying things over bit by, well, it starts to work again over here. So what if this, and then what actually is in that space instead of all the wrong stuff I put there? Yeah. And it's like trusting that feeling is coming from your unconscious, which is smarter than you, right? There's some part of your brain that's smarter than the part of you that you're using on purpose that's telling you something. And then the smart thing to do is listen to that other part of you and be like, okay, let's see what actually goes here. Yeah.
When you take the table read approach, when you gather your friends or your actors, do you know that you're not finished? Like, is it just the first draft? And I know that there's more work that needs to be done, or do you work on it until like, I think it's finished, I'm ready for a table read?
That's a really good question. I think earlier in my career, I more often thought things were done before I heard them. And they can be up to a point. Now I recognize that there's just simply a limit to how confident you can be alone at your computer. And it depends. The simpler the piece is, whatever that means, the simpler the story, the fewer, complexities that you're juggling in it, the closer you can probably get just alone at your computer. But especially above certain levels of complexity, numbers of characters, like sweep of story or whatever, at a certain point, you just have to hear it, and then you'll learn a new level of things. I think the key thing for me, what I would say is, the right time to do that is when I'm doing that not so that other people can tell me what to do, right, but so that I can get more insight into what I need to do.
100%.
It's a subtle but important difference.
Sure.
Yeah.
And do you find that you have to do like there's a lot more to do after that initial read, or it
depends. It depends. I mean, I think it has, again, it seems to have to do with how complicated the play is. There's also a way in which there's always something else to do. And then yet again, something else to do when you're in rehearsals or previews and you start to see things in a deeper way, like fully staged or whatever. But also there's a way in which whatever the problem still is seems to expand to fill all of like the worrying space in my brain. So like, it could be like early on, it could be like all of Act 2 doesn't work, and I'm very worried about that. And then later it's like scene 7 doesn't work, but it's bothering me just as much. And then later it's like that one speech in the middle of scene 7 still doesn't work. There's always something, right? There's always like, and I will obsess about whatever that is, that last turn of the screw.
Do you make changes even in the preview process?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. For like a typical regional theater, or you get like a week of previews maybe, and by the second to last one, you're probably freezing the show. So yes, it can be useful. Sometimes it's most useful as a place to take notes for the next production.
Right.
There really is, because the actors are human. Like there's a sheer amount of change that can be tolerated by a person rehearsing something new that afternoon and then performing it on stage that night. You might do more in like an off-Broadway preview process, or for something commercial where previews go on for 3 weeks or a month. You can do some decently complex changes. But again, even once rehearsal has started, there's a huge foreclosure in the level of changes you can make. Like it gets very hard to like, let's cut those two entire characters. Like you've already hired actors to play them. Like you can't. So, but yes, you certainly keep getting information. And then what you do with that information is kind of a calculation based on net gain. Like, okay, I can make these, 5 minor changes in the time we have, and they will all improve. Or I can try to do that one big change, which might actually make things worse, and then we won't have time to do anything else, and we'll just have to undo it. So you sort of are, deciding on those kinds of things.
Did you start writing plays before you went into the study of it, into academia, or did you?
Yeah. I mean, I was interested in writing from a really young age. I not plays initially. I was a big nerd, fantasy, sci-fi reader nerd. And so when I was a kid, I thought, I was like, oh, maybe being a writer could be a job. And I thought I'd write fantasy novels. And then I started getting interested more in theater towards the end of high school. And I wrote my first play, I think, senior year of high school. It was about a guy hanging out with his friends in high school. It was just like my completely mundane life experience somehow blown up to be like it was some epic play. It was everybody's first play. And then yeah, I did it as like my main extracurricular activity in college was theater. Yeah, and I wasn't a theater studies major. I was a humanities major. So it really was just a pursuit outside of class until grad school. And then I went to NYU for my MFA.
What was the trigger or the catalyst that made you?
For playwriting specifically?
Yeah.
It's funny because there's actually an answer to that. Like I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about it because you mentioned Gabi Alter in my bio. I wrote a musical called Nobody Loves You with him. It's my first musical. And Gabi's from Berkeley. We grew up together. Our parents were friends. And so he was like sort of an older brother figure to me. He's like 3 years older than I am. And he also went to Berkeley High, but he was 3 years older. So he was a senior when I was a freshman, and the seniors are very cool, right, in your mind. And the seniors at Berkeley High, the outsider, like artsy weirdo seniors at Berkeley High School are, you can imagine, like very artsy and very weird and very interesting. Although this was whatever the early 90s version of it was, right, which is when I was in high school. And Gabi and his friends would put on these crazy rock operas that they wrote themselves and performed in the Black Box Theater in the basement of a pizza place in Berkeley. There's a pizza place called Laval's Pizza and a theater under it called Laval's Subterranean Theater.
Nice.
And so I would go see these crazy rock operas that Gabi was writing. And I was like, oh, wow, theater's cool. It's what all the weirdest, coolest kids do. So that was what I was sort of thinking about it. And then Angels in America happened. And I remember reading about it on Broadway, and then it came to the Bay Area. It had been in the Bay Area before, but post-Broadway, ACT, which is the big theater in San Francisco, did a big regional production that I saw in, I think, 94, 95. And I started writing my first play the next day. So like the literal catalyst was watching Angels in America. Wow. And what's so funny is that years later, I was on a panel of playwrights talking to like young aspiring playwrights. And this question came up, like, what got you started? And there were different generations on the panel, people older than me and so on. But everyone of my generation on the panel had an Angels in America story, like all of us, 100% of us. So it's like that play created my whole generation of playwrights. It was just this huge, like, just this thing that showed the possibilities of the form, and then also tricked us all insofar as it became the center of the cultural conversation. So we all thought people would pay attention to plays and that plays were important, but it turns out like just that play was in that way, with rare exceptions, right? That and Hamilton and like 2 other things. but in any case, it got a lot of us started.
So you said that everybody had their own Angels in America story. So what specifically was yours?
I had read it. I remember buying the script like my junior year of high school, and I was touring colleges like the spring break of my junior year, like, oh, where am I? And I remember I had it with me and I was reading it. So like I associated it, I think. I loved it. It was a great piece of writing. And then also it did all these things I didn't know you were allowed to do in theater. It's magic and angels and this whole cosmology, and it's 6 hours long. It just appealed to my sense of like scale and ambition. And then because I was reading it while like going around the Northeast and looking at these college campuses, I associated it with like this growing excitement about the next phase of my life, and like intellectual pursuits and artistic pursuits. And so I think that planted the seed, and then I saw it on stage, and it was just a fantastic. It was a great production at ACT, but like, I don't know, just like the impact of it as a piece of storytelling, and that it was clear. Here's what I think it was. It was clear that there were things you could do in theater the illusion of theater, the way that what you're seeing is both happening, it's really happening in a way that movies aren't, because the actors are on stage in front of you. But it's not really happening in the way that movies are. Like in a movie, generally, you're actually on a street and they're in a car and then they're in the apartment, and but in theater, it's just like a chair in an empty space, and then a thing flies in and you can see the string. And somehow that inversion of the real presence of the people, but the total transparent illusion of the fictional reality felt somehow more magical to me than movies, which I also love, and TV, which I also love and write. But like, yeah. So I think it was that. It was like this sense of the magic of the form.
What was the process of NYU in choosing that school, getting in, and how did it change your playwriting?
That is a good question that I will answer totally honestly, because it has been 20 years. So I applied to a few grad schools. I went to NYU for a couple of reasons, which in retrospect, I still stand by. I think they turned out to be correct. One was I wanted to stay in New York. I had moved there and already been living in New York for a year. And that's a difficult transition to from your parents' home and then college, these two places that you're very well taken care of. And then this city where like no one gives a shit about you or what you've done. Like that's what's great about it. It's like, give it a shot, kid. Like try to make it here. Like
that's what they say. They say if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere.
Exactly. But it was so I just survived my first year in New York. And I felt like I had a foothold just psychologically. Like I wasn't depressed and like ready to leave. So the idea of leaving again for like 2 or 3 more years and then coming back, that didn't seem right. So I wanted to stay. And also NYU taught and still teaches screenwriting and TV writing along with playwriting. A lot of those other programs, and they're great programs, Yale or UCSD, they're just playwriting programs. And I mean that factually. I don't mean that as like a diminutive. It's merely playwriting.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, these other forms. I didn't realize at the time, by the way, that like that TV writing was going to completely take over the industry. I thought, oh, it's just a good skill to have, and maybe I'll do it to make some money at some point. And movies still existed and were a thing people made back then. So that's why I wanted these other skills, and I wanted to stay in New York. And it's a really good program. How did it affect my playwriting? I mean, in sort of an inverse way. The problems with it turned out to be, and people warned me about this, and I didn't put as much stock in it as maybe I should have, although I still might have made the same decision for those other reasons. You don't really get any productions there. If you're an MFA playwright at Yale or at UCSD or a lot of these other places, you get one full production a year, with the MFA actors and the MFA designers or whoever else. And as you later learn when you're doing this professionally, seeing your work fully produced is the best teacher. It's the best teacher. Making yourself watch an audience watch your play and all the stuff you thought was brilliant, they're super bored. Like that's the best teacher. So getting no productions over the course of grad school is a little bit of a problem for a playwright. I also felt frustrated by, not across the board. There were some great playwriting teachers there. I'll call out Gary Garrison, who taught us basic dramatic structure, a really great teacher, but also just like a a great person to have as a mentor at that phase of life.
Yeah, we had him on the spotlight a couple times.
Oh,
Once. Yeah, that's awesome.
Just like
Great to hear.
23 or whatever, and there's this guy who's like this combination, like den mother and drill sergeant in like equal measure. So he's like not going to let you off the hook, but he's also not going to let you fall. I really appreciated him. And this guy, Martin Epstein, who's like a really, really smart, sort of good at like tapping into what's your inner voice and so on. But a lot of the playwriting instruction there at the time really felt like you're all just sitting around a seminar table and you read someone's pages and there's someone at the head of the table being paid a lot of money and they say, so what did everybody think of Itamar's pages this week? And then there's a like completely non-curated conversation where there's, and I liked my classmates, but it just felt like I could do this for free on my couch, kind of, with 5 smart friends. And meanwhile, in TV writing and screenwriting, they were talking about craft. They were talking about beats. They were talking about story structure. And maybe some people don't respond well to that, some writers, but I was craving it. I was like, I can fill in the skeleton, but teach me the skeleton. I'll mention someone else actually on the theater side. There's a professor there named Gordon Farrell, who taught classic drama, which meant like literally like Greek, Roman, up through like French Court of Versailles stuff. And he talked about character and story in a theater perspective, you know, in Aristotelian terms, in a way that I also found like concrete and possible to get my arms around. But the truth is, my first year at NYU, I was very frustrated by a lot of the playwriting classes and the lack of any opportunity to see your plays. And my second year at NYU, I took no playwriting classes. I took only screenwriting and TV writing and did a screenplay as my thesis. But there was a weird way in which that was important too, because it kind of taught me that the so-called adults in the room or the authority figures don't always know what they're talking about. And if there's a little voice inside you saying, oh, actually, I think I need something else or to go in a different direction to maximize what I'm getting out of this, you can listen to that.
And it's interesting that you say that, because that's why I ask these questions when it comes to academia, because I've interviewed playwrights who've never gone through it. And sometimes I feel like with academia, it's just regurgitation of what they were told when they went through it. Mm-hmm. You know, you're just regurgitating what the professor that, you know.
It's so funny that you say that, because I've taught, I don't have time to do semester-long courses very often, but a couple of times I have taught like a semester-long playwriting course. And my approach is the opposite of that. My approach, literally, I remember crafting a syllabus for the first time, and my starting point was, what are all the things I wish someone had told me that no one did? It's like the opposite of what you just said.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, as I always do. There's always one question that comes up where, because you're not in the middle of it, you may not remember, you don't know. Do you know what those things are? Can you list those things, or at least give me a
the headline is like, what is basic dramatic, like what is dramatic action? Like, just what is it? And then that is the starting point for how this medium communicates story and meaning. I know more about it now.
Sure.
Like, it makes me cringe a little that how young I was when I was teaching and thought I knew everything. I know a lot more about it now than I did, 15, 20 years ago. But just the basic unit of dramatic writing as the starting point, a character who like seeking taking an action in pursuit of an objective, right?
Is that dramatic action?
Yeah, and then how that is the sort of wellspring of everything. Like, what is character? Well, you can write someone and give them an eye patch and an Irish accent and opinions and like all of those stuff. None of that is character. Those are all characteristics. I
feel like a lot of people do mistake that as character.
Whereas character is a tendency to make certain choices under certain circumstances. And so when we say, oh, your character needs to change, and then a young student writer is like, okay, well, at the beginning, he hates clowns. And at the end, he likes clowns. And it's like, well, he's changed. And it's like, no. The only way we will feel that your character has changed is if we see him in a situation, make a particular kind of choice, And then later we see him in an equivalent situation make a different choice. You have to show us the person making the choice. That is, and then there are exceptions. Then it's like, now it's week 6 of the course. Let's talk about Beckett. He does the opposite of all of this, but he's doing it on purpose because he's aware of the way you're supposed to do it. And that, they have no choices and nothing they do affects anything, and cause and effect don't obtain.
You said that you wanted somebody to teach you the skeleton.
Yeah.
What's the skeleton?
Oh, well, there isn't just one. And actually, now look, it's funny. I'm more forgiving now, because back then I was like, why? And I understand that you can end up with students who do stuff in a way that's sort of hollow and mechanical if you lead with this stuff, and that there is a school of thought that I don't dismiss that's like, no, just craft will come if they just write thing after thing after thing, and they'll see what works and what doesn't, and let's sort of cultivate their individual voice. And now when I teach, I sort of do both, but I feel like the latter happens when you're hearing people's pages and you get a sense of what their voice is, and you can be like, I love this. Like, this feels like this is what it's about. Is that what you're going for? Yes, you can lean harder. What is the skeleton? I mean, it's almost, there's a traditional shape that we're used to, right? That you could argue is this sort of very sort of classically male Joseph Campbell hero's journey thing. Mm-hmm. But that's just one example of like a much, much larger spectrum of ways through a story that has more to do with like a sense of a shape that very, very broadly speaking needs a beginning, middle, and an end, Right. But there's all kinds of ways to do that.
Sure.
And I think of it more like a game of chess. There's like that you're playing against yourself or against the audience, but there's an opening, then you're lost in this mid game where you may be looking at board positions no one's ever seen before because the game is that complicated, and then you're in a recognizable end game. I sort of
sure.
Like that.
So what did NYU, well, what did playwriting at NYU fix that you were, I don't want to call it making mistakes. I hate it phrasing like that, but a bad habit that you like it. Oh, okay. I didn't realize I was doing that. This is,
it's funny. I'll tell you, it wasn't the playwriting at NYU. It was in particular. NYU, but not my playwriting classes necessarily. And specifically, most of all, a TV writing class I took with a professor there named Charlie Rubin.
Which was going to be my next question. What did the screenwriting classes teach you that playwriting didn't?
Yeah, what I would say is...
Or how did it change it?
It was Charlie Rubin had this very, very craft-oriented way of talking about story, but also that didn't discount that you needed to be saying something like interesting and true, and that had some depth to it. But I remember this one moment. I took a class from him named called animated sitcom writing. He was running like an animated half hour on like VH1 or something at the time. And he was like, well, it's on my mind. I'm thinking about this form. Let me teach a class in it. And I took it. And I was a huge Simpsons fan. So he had us all write spec scripts for like some existing animated half hour of our choice. We wrote King of the Hill or whatever. So I wrote a Simpsons spec. And I remember some scene where he was like, well, the story, this isn't that strong, this part of the story. What if it went this way? And I said, that is stronger, but then I have to cut these 2 jokes, and they're my 2 favorite jokes in the script. And he said, if you can write 2 good jokes for this version of the story, you can write 2 good jokes for the other version of the story. Always get the story right first. And on some level, I knew that. Like, I knew it. But I remember thinking to myself, I'm in my final semester of grad school at Tisch, and that's the first time anyone has said that sentence to me. So I was like, but that's it. I think and it's a lesson I've had to relearn again and again, but like always get the story right first is the lesson, because everything else follows. Like, oh, I wrote this profound speech or a great joke or what have you, and I have to cut it if I change the story. A better version of the story will lead to better everything, to better surface expression of that story through speeches and dialogue and jokes and stuff. And so that, I think that was the biggest thing I took away.
How do you get the story right?
Painfully. I mean, I wish there were actually a formula. I don't think there is. I think all I can say is start by writing down the parts that you're pretty sure are right, you know?
Okay, sure.
Which as often as not isn't page one. Like, I know I want to write towards this turn or this big scene, and it's very clear in my head. Just get that into your final draft document or whatever. And there's a way in which it starts to shine light in both directions, you know? So even if it's somewhere in the middle, you're like, well, if this is a pillar that I've got, I now have a little bit more of an idea of how to get there and where it might go right after that, and sort of build out from there. Building, I mean, it feels more like cultivating a plant and trying to make it grow. I don't know. Get the story right. I don't know. I mean, that's why there's classes and books and workshops, like people that, you know, but there isn't, it's like the Supreme Court said about pornography, you know it when you see it.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. So you write outwards then. You'll start with a scene that might be in the middle.
Not necessarily. I'll start with a scene that I'm confident belongs, you know, and I want, ideally, that's actually as close to the beginning as possible. Sometimes it'll be the times that a story has grown most organically for me have been starting as close to the top as I can, but just writing every scene that I know is in it. You know, It's like, okay, it's this, and then sometime later this happens, and then sometimes later this, and then you have like a document that's like Swiss cheese kind of, but you feel pretty good about all the parts that aren't holes, you know, and then maybe things start to come to you to fill those because you've gotten some of that written down. I don't have a formula for how to write a story. I just have a collection of metaphors for what it feels like. You know, it's like like Swiss cheese, it's light shining. You get that first pylon into the rock wall so you can start climbing it. That's chess. That's all I got.
So it's still brilliant. So you finish NYU.
Yeah.
And what's the next step?
I was pretty lucky because I came out of NYU with at least my first couple of like regional productions of my plays. Because you so generously listed all the titles, I can now reference them. I had a play called Outrage, which was my application to NYU. Actually, I applied with an early draft of Outrage, and then I kept tinkering with it through grad school. And then my first year there, I wrote a play called Bach at Leipzig. So I had those two scripts, and I think by the time I came out of grad school, Bach at Leipzig was slated for a production up at the Hangar Theater, which is a sort of a summer stock theater up in Ithaca, New York. And Outrage had like won some little playwriting contest from a company called the Bloomington Playwrights Project in Bloomington, Indiana. And Portland Center Stage, which is a big regional theater in Portland, Oregon, was interested in the play. So I sort of had like the first couple steps, and I realized even at the time, I was like, this is very lucky because I could have just, you know, been out in the wilderness with no sort of hooks into the wall. But I had those. I wasn't really, you know, they were few and far between. Most of those things paid almost nothing. Portland Center Stage, the big regional theaters, royalties are good, but so I was still, you know, I was an office temp. I was working as a freelance SAT tutor. Like I was still doing what I had to do to pay my rent and eat. But I had those first couple of regional productions, and it was actually from, first of all, the lesson I learned from those was that before I had an agent, because I didn't have an agent at the time, to take advantage of the fact that theater is full of all of these non-competitive collaborators, which is to say they're designers, directors, actors, all these people who want plays to work on, who maybe have worked at this or that theater and know the artistic director or someone there. and they aren't your agent or they aren't your mom. Like they aren't someone either being paid to or for some other reason having like a predisposition to be like, you know, if your agent sends a play and is like, this play is good, it's like, well, of course you say it's good, you're their agent. But if the artistic director gets your script from an actor who they like, who just did a play there the year before, or a director or a lighting designer, they're more likely to read it with like, oh, someone recommended this with no agenda, who just genuinely thought I would like this. So my first few productions came out of that, just like putting scripts in people's hands and having them like pass it from person to person. And, you know, you knock on 50 doors and 2 of them open, but that's enough, you know,
right.
To get you started. And then it was from having those first few productions that I did my English is great. I did gotten but it was because of Portland Center Stage specifically, because I had no representation and they were like a serious theater with the managing director and like contracts and stuff, and I had no one to negotiate on my behalf. So it was actually the artistic director of Portland Center Stage who was like, well, we need to get you an agent so that someone can negotiate with us for you. And so, you know, my stuff got sent to some people in that context, like this person already has this production at this big regional theater. And so I think there was a contract to deal with. So I think that helped. And, you know, it was like a when it rains, it pours thing. I remember I had no representation. And then there was like this month when 2 or 3 things came out of the woodwork for different reasons. And I had a few meetings and got an agent. But it's important to say to listeners of your podcast that it isn't the answer to everything. You know, people get an agent and they're like, aha, now it's easy. They'll do everything for me. And it's like, as anyone knows, you can have a great relationship with an agent. It doesn't have to be bad, but it's, you know, agents are like matching grants. Like they tend to work as hard for you as you're working for yourself. You know, it's not like, oh, now I can sort of put the management of my career to the side and someone else will take care of all that.
So I find that somewhat in my experience and somewhat with yours, that when it comes to grad schools and whatnot, you get in because you've got good work. But I almost think that it's not counterproductive, because I almost find that the people who should be getting in are the people who need the help. You're a terrible playwright, but we'll take you because we think we can make you better. But it feels like it's the opposite. We'll take you because you're good. We you know.
It's a good question. You know, I know actors who have said similar things to me about conservatories. That you get in, people get in because they get gave a great audition. They have a lot of innate ability, and then all of the class time is spent working with the people who aren't that good. And so that may be more true in BFA programs than MFA programs where everybody is good and it's, you know, they're really tearing you apart. But I've never thought about that in terms of writers. I mean, it depends what you mean by needing the help. I think this returns to the question of craft versus, you know, individual voice and vision and something to say. Like you can't really teach that. You can teach craft. You can teach like, oh, here's how to construct a scene, but voice and ambition and a burning desire to express something and the bravery to do it, maybe you can teach that too, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox. I mean, or it depends how you look at grad school. Like I was hoping to learn things, especially about film and TV, which I had no experience in when I went to NYU. But also you kind of go there to get like the stamp of having gone there, you know, which is, I don't mean that, look, that's like a great thing. I think that's double-edged, especially because these programs some of them are free. A lot of them are, but some of them are quite expensive. So you're going into debt for this abstract stamp of approval but it's also just, and then some of it is what you can have great mentors, but also maybe it's just 2 or 3 years as of incubation, you know, to feel like to support your own psychological idea that you're taking yourself seriously as a writer. And then this doesn't apply to NYU, but at places where you do get full productions of your plays, that's a great way to learn about that process. Like I didn't have that until I was out of school and doing it professionally, and you're getting reviewed, and it's a scary way to do it.
Do you think, on that note, because you say that that's one of the best learning tools that you've got, do you recommend that, for playwrights that may not be getting those opportunities, to go ahead and just, take that leap and produce their own work?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's financial barriers to that. And then I think also, if you're self-producing, your mind may be in a bunch of different places. Like you're trying to market it and trying to make sure people come. So, but at the very least, take opportunities to hear it out loud. Even just like inviting actors, over to your apartment and having them read it cold and giving everyone pizza is a great way to get started. But yeah, I mean, self-producing, it's tricky. I think it's really hard, and I think it's hard to make the results polished. At least it would be for me, because I don't have the necessary producerial skills. But if you have those, or if you have a friend who has them, then by all means. I don't think I would have been enormously good at self-producing or gotten good results if I had. And then I don't know what it would have served, because I would have invited people to see something that didn't look good. But if you can, it's also an expensive, you brought it up as a way to learn. I wonder if there are, and the theater it's always suffering and full of dwindling opportunities, and it's triply true now. And one of the shames of recent closures is places like the Lark, or like these developmental places that people could start to see their work. Anyway, that's a long ramble. The short answer to your question is yes. Opportunities to see your work in front of an audience are super valuable. Yeah,
I do think that you did bring up a good point, because there's a lot of places that have closed. I mean, I haven't gotten back into producing yet, because a lot of the reasonably priced theaters here in LA have closed. They're not available anymore. Yeah. And I think that smaller markets, it might be a little bit more accessible, to find a reasonably priced, and just kind of get your work out there in that regard. But I think it is kind of gotten a little bit more difficult, because a lot of those places have, fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. Yeah. What have you, when you went into teaching playwriting, what did you find that you had to make your students unlearn?
Oh,
what were they coming in with you're like, you gotta unlearn
nothing.
this?
Nothing. I mean, when I've taught undergraduates, they haven't really learned anything yet. So there's always a handful who have some innate gift, and you try to, in one way or another, let them know, like, you're on the right track with this. And then there are people who don't, or don't seem to yet, but that's okay. You just try to, help them figure out what it is they're trying to accomplish, and and help them get there. And then with grad students, they, as the sort of baseline ability is significantly higher. And they really are their identities as writers are crystallizing. So there might be a school of thought that's like, no, don't have an identity yet. Let me break you down, but that's not my approach. I'm just sort of like, let me try to tease out the essence of the writer that you are. What I'll say, the biggest thing with grad students that I find a little bit funny is that, and I remember being this way, whatever is popular in theater then, like whatever the hit plays are that season, they hate. They hate everything that is successful professionally in the moment that they're in grad school. And it was only once I was teaching grad students and no longer being one that I grasped why. And it's self-protective. In order to enter this, some of it might be legitimate. It might be like generational differences, and I want to write because I want to do different stuff than what's happening. Another part of it might be what becomes most popular often isn't the most interesting work. It's the most widely palatable. But I think part of it is you want to believe there's space for you. Right. There's space for you to do something different or better when you're coming out of grad school. And that's easier if you're like, this all sucks. And you also haven't done it for as long, and you don't have I remember in college, my girlfriend at the time was like, she was into theater, but she was into more like mainstream musical theater than I was. She took me to see Les Mis in New York. And I remember being I was so snotty about it. I was like, what's this pretend, this stupid, like middle ground nonsense. And then years later, after I'd tried to write several musicals myself, seeing the movie of Les Mis, being like, what a masterpiece. Like they constructed this thing that works beginning to end. Cause like eventually how hard that is.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of give respect to anything that like achieves some like it works is
right.
like making something that works is so hard. So I think grad students may not quite know that yet. They've been beaten down.
How did you get to that point then to create things that work?
A combination of trial and error and luck. I think, just doing it. I mean, it's the 1,000 hours thing or whatever the Malcolm Gladwell rule is. You really do. You can't be in there's this famous Ira Glass speech quote that I really like about this, where he talks about how people get into creative pursuits or stuff like that because of their taste. Like they see something that they really like and they're like, I want to make something like that. And then they make something and then they can see it's not as good as the thing that they liked. And then at that moment, there might be a temptation to give up. But what you have to remember is that your ability to see the difference between the thing that you thought was great and what you made,
right?
That's the important skill. If you can see the gap, then you're on the right track. If you don't see the difference, if you're like, my thing is just as good and I don't see why everybody doesn't love it, then you might have a problem. But yeah, it's like having taste and an aesthetic, developing one, and then like learning. Yeah.
When you say aesthetic and playwriting, what is that?
I guess it's just a fancier word. I just meant it as a fancier word for taste, I think.
Fair enough. Okay.
Just like, what do you like? What feels good and truthful and to you? And then also another thing I had to learn was that like, I cannot and should not try to write in the style of everything that I like. I can go see something and be like, that was amazing. And if I went home and tried to imitate it, it would feel like what it is. It would feel like me imitating a style that's not my own. And that took me a while to learn too.
There was somebody that I had on, I can't remember which playwright, but he taught as well. And the one things he did is he didn't teach Miller or Williams or anything because he didn't want his students to try to emulate them.
Right.
So I can certainly understand that. What is let's talk about the path to the Tonys.
Okay.
What
well, there's a red carpet outside Radio City Music Hall.
How'd you get there? What play or plays?
Yeah.
Where was it? And then
it's so funny because it is just, if you actually trace back what led to what, it's fascinating. So and it just shows you like, just say yes to the things you're interested in and work with the people you want to work with and do the best you can and walk through the doors that are open. So like I went to college with a director named Michelle Tattenbaum. I acted some in college because it was fun and she directed me in a few plays. And then she's a year older than me. So she got to New York right before me. And then I got here and she directed a bunch of the early like readings and workshops of my plays in New York. We've worked together since. We just made a short film together during the lockdown. But her day job when I first moved to New York was she was the director of musical theater development at Manhattan Theater Club. And she introduced me to a composer named Norman Knoll, who had an idea for a musical. And Norman and I worked on this musical for a while, and Michelle was going to direct it, and we did some workshops. And as with many things, it didn't quite come to fruition and go anywhere. But I got ideas from it about the kinds of musicals I might want to write and that it might be a fun thing to do. Meanwhile, Gabi Alter, who I grew up with in Berkeley, ended up moving to New York a few years after me, and he did the MFA in musical theater writing at NYU. And we were friends. We were hanging out in Brooklyn anyway after he finished grad school. And we were like, maybe we should write a musical together. And so I sort of took some ideas I generated when working on this other thing and, you know, my desire to work with Gabi. And we wrote this musical called Nobody Loves You, about a satire about a reality TV dating show. And we asked Michelle to work on it with us, and she sort of became our director. And that was my first musical. So, and it was, you know, exactly what you're not supposed to do. 3 completely, essentially unknown people writing an original piece with not an adaptation, with no producers, not commissioned by a theater. Like, we did the opposite of the smart path, but we just made a thing that we liked and we thought was fun. And we ended up premiering it at the Globe in San Diego, and then it came to second stage off Broadway. And sidebar, Gabi and I are trying to bring it back now 10 years later, and nice. for a new era. But that aside, so that was how I started writing musicals, was just like this very organic thing with a few of my friends. Had I not done that, no one would have thought of me as a book writer. I would have just been this, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Band's Visit people would have called me anyway. But I think that was one thing. And then around the same time when I was writing Nobody Loves You with Gabi and working on it with Michelle, Michael Friedman and Daniel Auken called me because they had gotten the rights to Jonathan Letham's novel, The Front Fortress of Solitude, to do a stage musical. And they were like, do you want to work on this with us? And I loved the book. I didn't see how to make it a musical. I thought it was impossible. But I loved Michael. I loved Daniel. I was like, I want to work with these guys on this crazy project. So I did that. And so those 2 shows ended up premiering like back to back. We did Nobody Loves You off Broadway in 2013, and Fortress premiered at the Public in 2014. So when the Band's Visit team was being put together, which was in 2015, I had just opened 2 musicals in New York, just because I said yes to these things with my friends. Also my parents are Israeli immigrants. And the Band's Visit film is an Israeli film set in Israel. I've since heard from the producer, Oren Wolf, that had nothing to do with why they called me, my Israeli parentness. But in any case, so I just got this email out of the blue inviting me, you know, to meet with Hal Prince, who was attached to produce and direct at the time. He ended up leaving the project to do something else. And Oren Wolf, the producer, and to watch this movie and think about whether I wanted to adapt it. So the Tonys, I mean, the Band's Visit was my path to the Tonys. Like, it was that show premiering at the Atlantic and moving to Broadway, and like capturing the lightning in a bottle that some shows rarely do with great timing and so on. But that I was a book writer for musicals at all, like on the New York scene, was just, you know, it was just the sort of result of being in the mix and making work that interested me. You know, you can't strategize or plan that kind of thing.
Was that so? It was the Band's Visit, and yeah. any others after that? Nothing, man. I'm just curious.
Musicals or?
Oh, as far as Tonys go.
Oh, as far as Tonys, no, I just have the one.
That's all right. Hey, it's still more than I got.
We did. Yes. So I won Best Book for Band's Visit. And what's so funny, what I will say about it, is that maybe, and I think this is a useful lesson that I will share that maybe will be of use to others. When you have a big success like that, and, you know, it doesn't have to be winning a Tony, but like something that hits, you know, and you're hot for a second, all these opportunities come your way very quickly. And they may or may not be opportunities that you want or that excite you, but because they're coming at you because of this thing that happened, this rare, lucky thing that happened, you may think to yourself, I have to take all these opportunities, because if I don't take them, then I will have squandered this rare moment where this exciting thing happened. And what I decided was not to do that, because I decided there was another way of looking at it, which was that success had bought me something else, which was the freedom to be choosier, or the time to think about what I really want to do, or do something that was, follow it up with something riskier, or something that was just mine, or, you know, that it had created a soothing psychological space where I could think to myself, well, you had this big success. so you can slow down a little and don't have to be in such a rush and so competitive and all these things that aren't good for the actual writing, that's also what a moment like that can buy you. And so, because like for a year, when you win Best Book of a musical at the Tonys, for a year, you are everyone's first phone call when they want a book writer for a musical. For 1 year, and then someone else wins Best Book, and then you're the second phone call, and you're like gradually bumped down from there, right? So you're going to get offered insane things that like have nothing to do with you, where you're like, I lost count of the number of times where I was like, you should get a Black writer for that. You should get a gay writer for that. Like, you know, and not just like because I'm afraid of being canceled, but because like actually like, why are you offering me this opportunity? I'm the wrong writer for it. And it was just because people have very little, in the same way that you're annoyed when your stock is low, right? And you're like, why are the same 5 people getting offered everything and I'm getting offered nothing? When you're on that list of 5 people, it's actually troubling in the inverse, but a similar way. Where you're like, this is stupid. Like the fact that you're offering me all of this stuff just means you have no imagination. You know? So I hope I gave some other people opportunities by saying no, but I think they just probably moved on to the next most unimaginative choice. That wasn't your question, but that is what that is.
Oh, it's very insightful.
Yeah. So and I said yes to some things, right? I'm working on American Tail. I'm working on a new musical with David Yazbek, also who I did Band's Visit with, another songwriter, Eric De La Pena, who's a friend of his. So musicals are hard, so I'm choosy about them. But now that, you know, I can no longer deny that it's a big part of my career, I'm still doing them. Yeah.
What was it about American Tail that you said that made you jump and say yes to?
Two things. I'm 45 now, which means I was 9 years old when the movie came out. So like, and my parents are Jewish immigrants. There was this like, it was really unusual for the big hit, like animated film of the year to be about like a little Jewish mouse boy, you know, which at age 9, I don't think I consciously was like, oh, it's about my people. Like I was 9, like, and I went to a Jewish day school. I probably thought everyone was Jewish. I was like, Jews are a minority? What are you talking about? But in any case, I remember the movie. I remember watching it in school on a VHS tape. So when the offer first came from Children's Theater Company, that was my first reaction, was like, oh my God, I love that movie. But I also hadn't seen it in more than 30 years. Right. So I watched it again, and then there was the second part of why I said yes, which was, oh, I see why to do it now, because we were this was, 2016, 2017, whatever. And there was all this hot xenophobic rhetoric about immigrants and us and them and closing the borders. Mm-hmm. And it just felt so, I don't know, it just felt so un-American to me. And then you have this movie called An American Tale that's about immigrants. It's about New York and America more broadly as like a patchwork of wave after wave of immigrants and having a fantasy, an unrealistic fantasy about how perfect everything is going to be when they get here. And then it's not. And then, they strive and they work together and they make things better. And I was like, well, I see why they want to bring this story back now, actually. It's kind of perfect. So that was it. And also I knew, as I mentioned earlier, that there were only a few songs in the movie. And I loved the idea of writing. I love writing lyrics, and Alan Schmuckler and Michael Mahler, the composers, let me very kindly co-write the lyrics with them for the songs. And it just felt like a world where it'd be fun to write. You could do fun, witty, rhymes and like fun songs. And so that was the other thing I was looking forward to.
So you're working with the artistic director that's on his way out, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Peter Moses. Yeah, he's been there like 25 or 30 years.
Right, yeah.
He just announced 1 more year and then he's retired.
Oh, it's 1 more year. I was thinking it was this coming June or something like that. I thought it was like
June 24, I think. He's
okay. Okay.
I think he's, because those kinds of things, he needs to give them time to do a search and figure out who the next person is. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. You talked about commission a little bit earlier. What's that process? How does one get commissioned?
It's a good question. I haven't been in a while. I think that I think it's a thing that happens. at a certain point in the career of an up-and-coming playwright, where you've had maybe your first production, or you get readings at a bunch of the big off-Broadway theaters or regional theaters, and like you're not being widely produced yet, and it's a thing that theaters do kind of instead of producing you. We want a relationship with this writer. We think they're interesting. So we're going to give out like a handful of these commissions to these 7 people or these 9 people, and then see if any of the plays that result are plays you want to produce. And there's some theaters that have a really strong track record of like producing a lot of the plays commission, and there's some theaters that just almost never do it, but they do it because here's some money for this writer, and they'll write a thing, and then the play ends up someplace else. That's one way it seems to happen. And then sometimes, a writer will have a relationship with a particular theater. They did one thing there, it was a hit, everybody had a good experience, and they're like, well, we want your next one, so we're going to give you a commission. And they're basically just paying you for right of first refusal is basically what it is. I once had an experience where I had commissions from Manhattan Theater Club and Playwrights Horizons at the same time. And I turned in each play, and both theaters passed, and then the opposite theater produced the play. And it may have been because I guessed wrong about who would like what. Okay. But this other part of me was like, oh no, this is like dating. This is like psychology. It's like basic human psychology. You just want whatever if you have exclusive rights to something, you're not interested, but you want what the other person, had. Yeah. Something
about that. Yeah. It's the everybody else's food tastes better. I don't know what that is.
Exactly. Or you can have a specific idea, like you have meetings with people. Like that's where Yellow Jackets, my play Yellow Jackets, not the Showtime series, came from. I'm from Berkeley, and I had a meeting with Tony Taccone, who was the artistic director of Berkeley Rep at the time. He retired not long ago, but we just had a meeting where he was like, "What are some ideas you have for plays?" And I said, "This," and I said, "I've always wanted to write a play about Berkeley High," and he was like, "That's for us," because his son Jorma Taccone, who's now of course well known as a Lonely Island SNL guy, was one of my classmates in high school. So Tony had sent his sons to Berkeley High, and he knew how crazy that school was. So I didn't have to say anything else. As soon as I said, I want to write a play about Berkeley High, he said, write that. So there might be a specific idea you've pitched a specific theater to.
So when you get commissioned, they're not telling you, we want to play like this. Okay.
That can happen. Most of my commissions have just been like, here's a commission, write a play. The Yellow Jackets was an example of an idea I had already, but I found the right theater that wanted to commission it from me. My play that ended up at Playwrights Horizons, but had originally been commissioned by MTC, was commissioned by the Sloan Foundation. And the limitation there is they commission plays about math and science. So your play has to have some mathematical or scientific focus to qualify. But I had a nerdy science play idea, so I wrote that one. And then sometimes, people will. That tends to interest me less. I like excuses to write what I was planning to write anyway. Mm-hmm. Like that's sort of how I do. But sometimes it will happen. They'll be like, "We want a new adaptation of Euripides, like Iphigenia or whatever, but set in Chicago in the 1920s, whatever." And then they'll commission you to do that. But
so. They give you a commission. So what does that consist of? Is that like, here's a chunk of change, go write?
Yes.
And
it is some, small but real amount of money. And then some timeline for turning in a first draft.
It's like 2,000 to 5,000. I'm just curious, not to be.
It depends. It depends on the theater. It depends on where the playwright is in their career. Early, 5. Maybe if you're luckier or in a better position, 12, could be 12,000. But also, I don't know what the economy of it is like now.
Sure. Is it, and then is there a timeline?
Yeah, there is, but my experience is no one cares. Like, maybe there are theaters that are really draconian about it, and you're like, oh, you were supposed to turn in the first draft after a year, and now it's been 13 months. Where's the play? Like, I think I still owe a commission to the Goodman from 8 years ago, if not longer. Like, because it's just you take all these commissions. I took a chunk of them at a time when I was writing a lot of plays, before I was doing musicals, before I was doing television, And so you think, oh, I'm writing plays at this pace, I'll fulfill these all. And then at some point my focus shifted and my writing of plays slowed way down. And the last 1 or 2 commissions I took, I just still haven't written that many plays. But there is the short answer is there is a timeline. But it's really, my experience is that it's really just to give you some sort of framework.
Right.
But what they want is a good play.
And it's not a complete, they just like the draft that you don't have to, it's like
there's usually steps, like try to turn the first draft by this date. And then a clock starts ticking on the exclusivity of their rights. So usually it'll say something like they have to do a reading within X number of months. And then after the reading, they have X number of months to decide if they're going to produce it or not. The commission may include a step for a second draft, but whatever it is, there's some point where they have to make a decision. We're going to produce this or not. And if they decide not, you get the play back and you can take it wherever.
So they don't have exclusive. They just have the exclusivity for that first run, that first production.
Yeah, for and only for a limited time. Like if they don't decide soon enough, they have to
okay. At some point. And outside of American Tail, what else are you working on?
I have a new play called The Ally, which is about a professor at like a liberal arts college who is like me. I mean, I'm not a professor at a liberal arts college, but he's like me in the sense that he's the child of Israeli immigrants and a committed, lefty in American politics, but who ends up in a situation that I think a lot of Jews in America on the left find themselves in these days, where he finds himself in a sort of sticky paralysis around the question of Israel, that like the people in American politics who are the most protective and supportive of Israel are the people with whom he disagrees on everything else. And the people with whom he is allied politically are the most critical of it. And he shares those criticisms, but then there's this other like tribal, feeling in him about like, but hold on a second, are they really the worst? It basically came out of like conversations I had and a feeling I had around this issue. And I was like, well, what if I like put someone in that situation and then pushed it as far as it would go?
Sure.
So I'm going to knock wood now because we don't have the official slot yet, but it's supposed to premiere off Broadway next season, maybe about a year from now. And like I mentioned, Yazbek and I, who I did Band's Visit with, are doing another musical together that we might be working on with Audible. Like Audible, of course, does a lot of audio plays and so on, but they also own the Minetta Lane Theater, which is a theater downtown in New York, and they stage things. So we're talking to them about maybe doing it as a stage piece, and then also maybe there can be an audio version. And that's the true story of this story's insane, by the way. You and your audience should literally just Google this guy, but it's based on the true story of this guy named Elmer McCurdy, who was a real outlaw in the waning days of the Old West. He was very bad at it. He did a bunch of failed robberies and then died. And then through a series of weird choices and coincidences by the coroner and then other people, he ended up embalmed and being used as like a carnival display, like come see the bandit who would not give up, but then like passed from hand to hand, having all these weird adventures for 60 years. So like for twice as long as he was alive, he was like this spectacle in various forms, in various ways, until people forgot his name and who he really was. And so Yazbek and this other songwriter, Eric De La Pena, wrote sort of a song cycle about Elmer's life and death, and we're trying to turn it into something that works on stage.
Without a spoiler alert, do we know where Elmer is now?
We do. I mean, you can, it's not a spoiler because it's all on Wikipedia and other places, but he was eventually found. His final step on his crazy journey was as a decoration in a dark ride in an amusement park in the Long Beach Pier in Southern California. And when people finally, and by that point, people had forgotten it was a real human body. People thought this was a dummy that was like part of the scary decorations for this ride. And someone figured out that it was a corpse, an embalmed corpse. So, and then they traced back the mystery and they figured out who he was. So he's buried in Oklahoma where he died.
Oh.
And his gravestone says, Eleanor McCurdy, born 1880, died 1911, buried 1977.
Oh my God. Wow.
He's in Guthrie, Oklahoma.
Do you have a preference? Do you enjoy writing musicals or plays better or more?
I think if I had to choose, I would choose plays, just because it's the purest expression of exactly what I want to do, ideally when I'm pushing myself. And music, I love musicals. I'm glad I don't have to give them up. I like the collaborative aspect of them. I love writing lyrics. I like the power music has over an audience, a power that mere words can't really have when music's doing what it can really do. So I love all of that, but I don't write music. And they're just such big pieces of machinery. They never feel completely mine in a way that, which is good. There's like an egolessness that I think is good for the work. But I think playwriting is the sort of center.
Sure. So two last questions. Any advice for aspiring playwrights?
I think the general advice to aspiring playwrights at any moment in the history of theater or this country is, just go for it. Like, there is room for you. The more personal and idiosyncratic and specific you can be about what is the story only you can tell and the way only you can tell it, that's how you're going to forge your path. That's my general advice. I think anyone looking at the landscape now might be like, is this the time? I mean, the economy's horrible. Theater is like, already was on such shaky financial ground, and now these big theaters are closing left and right, and audiences aren't back yet. I think that's all true, but I think that means that this might be exactly the moment, because the existing model wasn't great, actually, for artists and the art in a lot of ways. And now people were like, oh, the model was unsustainable. Well, it was sustainable. It was sustained for years. It was just sustained on like the largesse of, extremely wealthy people, which is great and necessary in a country that doesn't have any public funding for the arts, really. But that model is now becoming unsustainable. And I think out of the ashes will come opportunities for new, interesting work. Like theater, people are like, oh, theater's dead, and like, or it's always dying. And what's always almost dying is the institutional theater. But theater is the only art form. Like, if the apocalypse happens, the only art form we'll have is theater. There won't still be movies. There won't still be TV, but there'll be people standing around the fire acting out stories. Theater can't die. It literally can't. So I don't know. I feel like there's also a huge generational turnover in leadership. There's a lot of people who've had those big artistic director jobs for 20 or 30 years, and they're retiring, some of them very graciously, some of them not soon enough, but they're retiring. And that means that new, younger generations of leadership are cropping up. Of course, having the reins handed to them at the exact moment that everything's a disaster, but some of them are going to figure it out. So I think it's a really, really delicate moment now, but my suspicion is it's right before the next big boom.
And finally, where can people find your work?
Good question. My plays, you can buy them online, on Amazon, or better, probably the Drama Bookstore. There's one in LA. So if you're local to James, go to the one in LA. If you're in New York, go to the one in New York. You can order from their website. So you can buy, a lot of my plays are published. Even
your older work?
Yeah. A lot of my early plays published by what was Samuel French and is now Concord Theatricals, and Faber and Faber has some of my scripts. The Band's Visit is TCG publishes a script of The Band's Visit, and then hopefully, I don't know, maybe one of them will be produced in a theater near you, and then in the meantime you can stream old episodes of TV I wrote for Boardwalk Empire or The Affair.
Wow! All right, impressive. Are you on the socials?
Facebook, but not really the others. No.
All right.
No. I didn't have to leave Twitter because I never got on Twitter.
Fair enough. Yeah. I have so many accounts that I'm terrible at. I don't think I've posted on most of them, and I don't keep it up to date. What was that final thing that I was just going to mention about that on the Facebook and the socials? Whatever. I forgot it. But I'm glad we got to do this. Wait, that's what it was. When does American Tail open?
Previews begin, I think, April the 25th or 26th, and official opening night is April 29th, and then it runs in Minneapolis at CTC until mid-June, I believe. I think there's a possible extension, but at least till mid-June.
Wonderful. Itamar, I'm so glad we got to do this. Thank you so much for coming on the Playwright Spotlight.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and share this channel with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, and until we see each other again, keep writing.